A royal council held behind locked doors. No cameras, no press, and one conspicuously empty seat, Catherine's. While the palace claimed scheduling conflict, insiders whisper of something far more sinister, a deliberate exclusion, orchestrated from the inside. But why? And who gave the order to keep her away? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began with murmurs, a quiet unease that grew louder as the date of the so-called private council approached. Held at Sandringham, the gathering was supposed to be routine, at least. That's how it was painted in the royal briefings. But behind the scenes, the stakes were anything but ordinary. Senior royals were summoned. Key matters, including the long-term restructuring of the monarchy, were whispered to be on the agenda. And Catherine, Princess of Wales, who had steadily become the monarchy's most vital public face, was expected to attend. Her name was on preliminary drafts. Her security team had been briefed. Even her stylists had cleared her calendar. But on the day of the meeting, her chair sat empty, conspicuously untouched, like an open challenge to her place within the firm. When reporters questioned the palace, the answer was swift and hollow, scheduling conflict. But no one believed it. Not the royal correspondents who had watched Catherine ascend in influence. Not the public, who sensed something far more calculated. And certainly not the insiders who began to leak whispers that someone powerful had moved against her. Leaks emerged within hours. A senior aide had allegedly intervened, advising the king that Catherine's presence might distract from the purpose. There was no warning, no consultation, no apology. What followed behind palace doors was, by all accounts, emotionally devastating. Sources close to Kensington claimed Catherine was blindsided. She reportedly wept behind closed doors, not out of vanity, but because the exclusion struck a chord deeper than mere protocol. It echoed past betrayals. It evoked the very dynamics she had spent years rising above whispers of being an outsider, a commoner, a woman whose poise and popularity unnerved the establishment's oldest guards. William, they say, was livid. But at that moment, it was Catherine who bore the weight of the humiliation. And yet, even as the narrative spun publicly, she said nothing. Not a word, not a glance of bitterness. Only silence, and silence can be louder than any scream within the walls of royalty. As the press softened the story, those in the know began to point fingers. The incident wasn't an oversight, it was an ambush. And though no one was named, palace insiders already suspected a force operating in the shadows, a figure long known for manipulating access to the king and maintaining a grip over who sat at which table and who didn't. But this exclusion wasn't a standalone mistake. It was the spark that ignited a royal firestorm, leading King Charles to make a decision no one expected. He was known only as the strategist. For over a decade, he operated behind the scenes, crafting narratives, silencing scandals, manipulating access. But now, his name is at the center of a royal reckoning, accused of undermining the Princess of Wales herself. Sir Reginald Mallory wasn't just an advisor, he was a gatekeeper. For years, he controlled the flow of information that reached King Charles's desk. Nothing entered the monarch's ear without first passing through Mallory's filter. Trusted, feared, and seldom seen, his presence was woven into the very structure of royal decision-making. But behind the mask of strategy was a man deeply suspicious of change and deeply threatened by Catherine's rising prominence. As the Princess of Wales grew into a global icon, Reginald saw something different, a destabilizing force, a modernizer wrapped in silk, with the public's love in her hands. To him, Catherine wasn't just the future, she was a disruption, and Reginald didn't tolerate disruption. Sources now allege that his subtle war against her had been waged for years. Whisper campaigns, last-minute agenda changes, strategic absences from photo ops. He never confronted her directly. Instead, he chipped away at her presence, one carefully masked oversight at a time. Their quiet battle came to a head over media control. Catherine had long advocated for transparency, bringing her own team into key messaging decisions. Reginald, steeped in old-world secrecy, resisted. When Catherine proposed new documentary access for royal charity work, Reginald blocked it. When she requested briefing notes ahead of private strategy sessions, his office delayed. And when she pushed back, palace insiders say he retaliated not openly but surgically. And then came the private council. According to multiple sources, it was Reginald who suggested she be left out, framing it as a necessary move to maintain focus. A convenient excuse. But the leaked internal correspondence paints a damning picture. Phrases like contain her narrative and limit her overreach appeared in memos forwarded to external allies. When those documents were leaked, they lit a fire no spin could extinguish. The press turned, the public noticed, and inside the palace, Reginald's unshakable image began to crack. Still, he didn't flinch. He had weathered scandals before. He had silenced far louder controversies. But what he underestimated this time was Charles's evolving loyalty. The king had watched for months as Catherine navigated impossible pressures with elegance. He had seen her rise while others faltered, and he had grown wearier than Reginald knew. Because this wasn't just about control anymore. This was about trust, and the man who once stood as Charles's closest confidant was now exposed as the very one who undermined the woman the king increasingly viewed not just as his daughter-in-law, but as his ally. Yet what Sir Reginald didn't count on was that the king's patience had quietly worn thin, and Catherine wasn't as isolated as he assumed. When Prince William stormed into Clarence's house, aides say the door shook from the force. "You let this happen," he roared. What followed was a confrontation that tore through years of restraint and finally exposed the divide between the future king and the one who wears the crown. What unfolded behind those ancient doors was not just a disagreement between a father and his son, it was an eruption of years of unspoken fury. William didn't come to seek answers. He came with fury. Fury for Catherine, for the humiliation she was made to endure, and for the manipulation that had crept into the very veins of the monarchy. For a man trained his entire life to maintain composure, William's raw emotion was volcanic. Insiders say his voice shook the room, accusing Charles not just of complicity, but of betrayal. "You knew," he reportedly said, "and you let it happen. You let her be treated like this." The weight of that statement lingered in the air like smoke. It wasn't just about one meeting, it was about a pattern. A feeling that history was repeating, that the wounds of the past were being ignored in the name of tradition, and that once again, someone beloved by the public was being pushed to the margins by the very institution meant to protect her. Charles, stunned, did not immediately respond with anger, but his defense was cold, steeped in protocol. He reminded William of structure, of process, of roles that must be respected. He spoke of advisors doing what they felt was best, of decisions made to preserve order, not to wound. But William wasn't having it. "You're pushing us out just like before," he said, his voice reportedly trembling not with rage but with sorrow. The implication was chilling. William had seen what sidelining looked like before. He'd watched it happen to his mother, he'd seen it unfold again with his brother, and now, with Catherine, it was more than a pattern. It was a legacy of silence, sacrifice, and slow erasure, and he wasn't going to let it happen again, not on his watch, and certainly not under his father's roof. This wasn't just a disagreement over a missed meeting. It was a mirror held up to decades of royal dysfunction, a confrontation between the old guard and the new heir, between a king bound by allegiance to his loyal circle and a son who had no patience for shadows anymore. Behind closed doors, it became clear that the crown wasn't just being worn, it was being questioned, and the emotional undercurrent ran deeper than anyone expected. Diana's absence, Harry's exile, Camilla's rise, it all swirled beneath the surface of that one explosive exchange, haunting every word between father and son. But in the end, it wasn't William's fury that shifted the palace walls. His storm had passed, but the damage had already been done. And while the king reeled from the confrontation, the real reckoning was already taking shape quietly, powerfully, and unmistakably, in the form of the woman they had tried to silence. But it wasn't William's rage that tipped the balance. It was what Catherine did next that turned a royal scandal into a royal reckoning. She said nothing, but her silence screamed. At a charity event days later, Catherine arrived alone, declined comment, and refused a seat next to Camilla. The message was unmistakable, and it sent shockwaves through the royal establishment. For a woman who had been expected to shrink quietly into the background after the private council snub, Catherine's next move was anything but submissive. She emerged not with fury, not with tears, but with precision. William did not accompany her. It was not an oversight, it was a statement. The princess walked into the charity gala with an icy grace that was unmistakably intentional. Alone, yet not alone. She carried with her the weight of betrayal and the fire of quiet defiance. The seat beside Camilla remained empty, unacknowledged. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't forgotten. It was a deliberate choice to draw a line through the old alliances, to unmask the fault lines within the House of Windsor. The photographers captured the moment, but it was the silence between the flashes that told the story. Something had broken, and she was no longer willing to pretend. What she wore only fueled the blaze, a sleek, tailored black gown eerily reminiscent of Diana's iconic revenge dress. But this wasn't about vengeance. It was about dignity. It was about presence. It was about reclaiming the narrative from those who thought they could control her path. There were no speeches, no pointed remarks, just a steady gaze, a calm exterior, and the unmistakable aura of a woman who had outgrown the box they tried to keep her in. The reaction was instant. Headlines didn't just report her appearance, they dissected it. Royal commentators scrambled to read between the lines. Social media ignited like wildfire. Within hours, #WeStandWithKate trended globally. Thousands of posts flooded in, painting her not as a victim, but as a symbol of resistance within the monarchy. Inside the palace, the pressure was suffocating. Charles, already shaken by William's outburst, now faced a far more public crisis. Allies warned him of shifting tides. Advisors urged damage control. And behind closed doors, the king reportedly admitted, "She's making me look weak." But that wasn't her intention. Catherine wasn't playing politics, she was protecting her place, her dignity, and her truth. And she was doing it with the one weapon no one expected her to wield so powerfully: composure. While others had schemed behind curtains, she made her statement under the brightest lights. And while others hid behind protocol, she stood alone, fearless and unshaken. This wasn't merely a royal snub answered with silent defiance. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous for the establishment, a shift in public loyalty, a reawakening of memory, and a brutal realization that the palace could no longer manipulate its most powerful voice from within. As public sentiment swelled behind the princess, the palace couldn't ignore the crisis anymore. And King Charles was about to face a choice that would define his reign. It was meant to be a routine briefing. But what transpired in the king's study that afternoon was anything but bar. Sir Reginald entered with confidence and left without a title, without a desk, and without a trace of his former power. The room was quiet when he arrived, just as it had always been. For years, Sir Reginald Mallory had walked into that chamber with absolute certainty. He had advised the king through crisis, managed the court through scandal, and orchestrated the inner workings of a monarchy built on secrecy and control. But this time, something was different. King Charles didn't rise to greet him. There were no warm pleasantries, only stillness. And then a single sentence that cut like ice: "You've made her an enemy of the crown." Reginald, ever the strategist, tried to pivot. He spoke of protocol, of preserving the old order, of protecting the monarchy from modern chaos. But Charles didn't blink. For the first time in their decades of working together, the king wasn't hearing a trusted advisor, he was facing a man who had humiliated the very woman he now considered central to the monarchy's survival. Reginald misjudged the moment. He underestimated the emotional toll the past weeks had taken. He tried to present Catherine's exclusion as tactical, even necessary. But Charles wasn't interested in tactics. His voice rose, not in rage, but in something far more dangerous: conviction. "She is my daughter now," he said, his voice cracking with something few had ever seen from him: emotional vulnerability. "And you used my trust to diminish her." The accusation hung in the air. No one moved, no one dared to speak. And then the words that sealed Reginald's fate: "This is your last audience." In a monarchy built on loyalty and perception, such a dismissal was seismic. Aides nearby, used to Sir Reginald's presence as a permanent fixture, were stunned. The king's decision wasn't just swift, it was surgical. There would be no retirement party, no public gratitude, no official farewell. Only silence. Reginald left through the back corridors, escorted not by honor, but by obscurity. In mere minutes, his name was removed from schedules, his office emptied, his authority erased. At the edge of the study, Queen Camilla stood watching silent, her expression unreadable. She said nothing as the man who had long championed her influence disappeared behind a closed door. Whether her silence was approval or fury, no one could say, but her eyes followed Reginald until he vanished from view. Charles stood alone, surrounded by the weight of a monarchy in flux. He had removed the architect of exclusion, but he knew that this alone would not undo the damage. The kingdom had seen the fracture, the people had taken sides, and Catherine's dignity had become the battleground on which his leadership would now be judged. The dismissal was an act of reckoning, but not yet of redemption. But removing Reginald was only part of the solution. The kingdom had seen the fracture, now Charles had to heal it publicly and permanently. In a move both symbolic and strategic, King Charles invited Catherine to lead the next council briefing publicly. Cameras rolled, hands were shaken, and with a single step into the chamber, she reclaimed the power they tried to deny her. It was not just an invitation, it was a royal declaration. The Princess of Wales was no longer on the sidelines. She was at the table, front and centre, not as a token participant, but as a leading force. Days after the fallout from the charity gala, Charles shocked palace insiders by issuing a direct order. Catherine would chair the next royal council briefing. No middlemen. No filtered memos. She would lead it, and the press would be allowed to witness it. What began as a private insult had now exploded into a public rebalancing of royal power. As the princess walked into the chamber with grace and composure, every eye turned not toward the king, but toward the woman the nation had just rallied behind. It was Catherine's moment, and she didn't blink. Charles opened the briefing with what many described as a carefully scripted, yet deeply weighted statement. A guiding voice in our future, he called her. Those 6 words weren't just praise, they were a message to every remaining loyalist of the old order, every whispering courtier still clinging to fading influence. This was the king's daughter now, and she was untouchable. William stood behind her, literally. He didn't step ahead, he didn't overshadow, he stood at her side, letting the spotlight fall squarely where it belonged. For the first time in years, the royal narrative had shifted, and it wasn't about the sovereign or the heirs or the institution. It was about her. Behind the scenes, panic ignited across the palace's internal hierarchy. Advisors began realigning. Influence maps were redrawn. Those once loyal to Sir Reginald found themselves quietly excluded from strategic briefings. In their place emerged names Catherine trusted individuals known not for tradition, but for innovation, diplomacy, and calm strength. Rumors swirled that an entirely new advisory team was being built around her, independent yet influential, shaping not just her public engagements but her policy positions. The media noticed, the public embraced it. Suddenly, Catherine wasn't just the most admired royal, she was the most powerful. But power in the palace comes at a cost. While the official footage from the council portrayed unity and forward momentum, tension still festered beneath the polished surface. One pair of eyes watched Catherine's rise not with celebration, but with silent calculation. Camilla's presence at the event was ceremonial, her expression tightly controlled. She offered no words of support, no gestures of warmth. To some, it was a signal. To others, a warning. Yet while the palace projected unity, tensions beneath the surface were far from resolved, especially between Camilla and the woman now commanding the public's heart. She didn't speak to the press. She didn't issue a statement. And most chilling of all, she didn't smile at Catherine. Camilla's silence was louder than any headline, hinting at a storm yet to come within the Queen's own domain. In the wake of Catherine's triumphant re-entry into royal prominence, Queen Camilla all but disappeared. Public appearances were quietly cancelled. Scheduled events were reassigned. Her once dominant presence in the royal calendar began to evaporate, and the absence was deafening. Insiders claimed it was due to fatigue, but the timing was far too precise to be coincidence. This was not retreat, it was calculation. Behind palace walls, the whispers grew louder. Camilla, once considered the stabilizing power behind Charles, had grown disillusioned. Not with the monarchy, but with the man she had worked so long to elevate. She saw in him now what she had feared for years: hesitation, softness, and a growing dependence on a woman who was never part of their plan. Those closest to the Queen began to murmur that she considered Charles's decision to publicly elevate Catherine a mark of weakness, an impulsive bow to public pressure that betrayed the loyalty of those who had protected the crown through scandal and bloodshed. Her confidence in the king was quietly eroding, and with it, the internal structure of the palace began to split. Royal aides noticed it first. Meetings once attended jointly by Charles and Camilla were now separated by subtle absences. Staff who had long served both found themselves assigned to one camp or the other. The divide was no longer whispered, it was felt. Private dinners hosted by the Queen began to change in tone. Certain names disappeared from guest lists, while new, younger courtiers often loyal to Catherine rose in their place. Traditionalists who had once shaped royal protocol were now shut out. Invitations went undelivered, emails unanswered. Camilla, who had built her reign on survival and strategy, was not surrendering, but she was repositioning. And as the public watched Catherine ascend with grace and power, cameras began to catch moments that betrayed the real story. One particularly damning clip: Camilla and Catherine standing inches apart, their bodies still, their smiles absent, their eyes locked in mutual detachment, was dissected frame by frame in the tabloids, fueling speculation of a rift too wide to mend. In the center of it all was Charles, a man caught between the woman who fought to legitimize his reign and the woman now defining its legacy. He sought peace, but peace would not come. Every move he made now risked alienating one or the other, and the burden of balance was beginning to crack his composure. To the outside world, the monarchy was stabilizing, but inside it was on the brink of something deeper, an internal war of influence that could no longer be denied or delayed. And as alliances fracture within the royal walls, a new force was quietly preparing to rise, one that would change the shape of the monarchy itself. First it was Catherine, then came whispers of Princess Anne, and now even Beatrice and Zara are being courted for influence. The old male-dominated council is fading and a new sisterhood of Windsor is preparing to take its place. But with this rise comes one haunting question: who will be sacrificed? The transformation was subtle at first: an extra seat at the advisory roundtable, a quiet nod in strategy meetings, a single name added to diplomatic briefings. But now, the pattern is impossible to ignore. Catherine is no longer a symbolic figure of grace. She's an active architect of the monarchy's evolution. Her voice isn't just heard, it's driving decisions. Her calendar is packed with meetings once reserved for senior statesmen. Her input is sought not just for appearances, but for the direction of the institution itself. And in her rise, she's not alone. Princess Anne, long respected for her stoic strength and no-nonsense attitude, has stepped closer into the limelight, offering what insiders call grounded guidance to her niece-in-law behind closed doors. Her praise, though rare, was direct. She's doing what needs to be done. Coming from Anne, it was a coronation in its own right. Beatrice and Zara, once considered peripheral, are suddenly appearing with increasing frequency at state events, behind podiums and on advisory boards. Their rise is no accident. They represent the next wave of royal femininity, polished, professional, and fiercely loyal to the crown's modern face. This is no longer a monarchy of patriarchs. It is becoming something else entirely: a network of royal women strategically rebalancing power within an institution that once left them in the shadows. And yet, this shift has not come without consequence. The old guard watches with clenched jaws as the pillars they built are restructured by hands they once overlooked. For traditionalists within the palace, this Windsor sisterhood is more than a cultural shift. It's a threat. Power is being redefined. Influence is changing shape. Where once policy was discussed in hushed tones by male advisors over brandy, it is now being reshaped by women in action, collaborative, forward-thinking, and unbothered by outdated hierarchy. This generational shift is exhilarating to some, terrifying to others. The tension is no longer hidden. It breathes through every leaked memo, every strategic absence, every forced smile at joint appearances. The monarchy is dividing not through bloodlines, but through ideology. Still, the question now is not whether this rise will continue, it's how far it will go before it invites retribution. Because for every gain made by Catherine and her allies, a cost waits in the shadows. Change, especially in a house built on legacy, always demands sacrifice. And in a palace where no move goes unnoticed, someone will fall to make space for what's next. The only unknown is who and how public the fall will be. Because with each step forward, the stakes rise higher, and those who once operated in the margins are now seated at the table, strategic, watchful, and fully aware that the next play will determine everything. But while the palace reinvents itself with poised elegance, one final betrayal lurks in the shadows, one that could undo everything. Just when the monarchy seemed to stabilize, a letter surfaced unsigned but damning. Leaked to a foreign tabloid, it exposes Catherine's private correspondence and traces back to an address in Geneva. Sir Reginald may be gone, but his influence might be far from over. The headline hit without warning. A Swiss-based news outlet published excerpts from confidential messages, allegedly written by the Princess of Wales herself. The content wasn't explosive in the political sense, but it was deeply personal. Fragments of private reflections, carefully selected and placed for maximum damage. Hints of internal frustration. Unsent messages, notes from briefings. None of it illegal, all of it devastating. What made the leak even more chilling was the precision. It wasn't a careless dump of documents, it was a surgical strike, designed to erode trust, to introduce doubt, and to cast Catherine's ascent in a new, controversial light. The palace scrambled to trace the origin, but their own cyber team quickly discovered something far more sinister: metadata linking the files to a digital address long associated with a shell firm in Geneva. A shell firm previously connected to none other than Sir Reginald Mallory's private consulting ventures. He had vanished from the palace corridors, but the mark of his hand was unmistakable. It wasn't just a leak, it was a message. Reginald wasn't going quietly into retirement. Whispers began to circulate that he had been quietly assembling a coalition of former aides, disillusioned aristocrats, and foreign press connections. A shadow network, bent on reclaiming the narrative and exposing what he saw as the emotional hijacking of the monarchy. There were no direct accusations, no fingerprints, but the timing, the method, and the knowledge of internal operations pointed in one direction, and the impact was immediate. Journalists flooded palace gates with questions. Social media once again split into chaos. The monarchy, which had just begun to mend its fractured image, found itself plunged back into suspicion. But inside Kensington Palace, Catherine's response was startling in its calm. Upon being shown the letter, she reportedly offered only one word: expected. There was no panic, no denial, no spin, only a quiet understanding that this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new kind of warfare, a war not of swords or scandal, but of shadows and whispers, where loyalty meant everything and nothing all at once. And while the press speculated endlessly, another headline quietly emerged: King Charles had been moved to a private wing of the estate for rest and recovery. The stress, aides admitted, had taken its toll. The pressure of balancing legacy, power, and a family teetering between rebirth and implosion had begun to crush the crown he wore. He had removed his most trusted advisor, he had elevated a new generation, and now he was watching it all slip beyond his grasp. The war inside the palace has only just begun, and as Catherine's star rises, so too do the shadows waiting to pull it down. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.